There's a moment that happens in certain conversations. At first, everything feels normal. Two people speaking, sharing perspectives, going back and forth. But then something subtle starts to reveal itself. You begin to notice that nothing you say is actually changing anything. You can explain your perspective clearly. You can slow down and try another angle. You can articulate the same thought 3 different ways, and none of it moves the conversation forward. The outcome is already decided. And when that realization appears, you start to feel it internally, like a kind of tension. Not because someone disagrees with you, but because you can tell the conversation itself isn't allowed to move. At that point, something important has already happened. The conversation has stopped being a conversation, even though the talking continues. There's a difference between talking to someone and talking at someone. Talking to someone means the conversation is still open. Neither person knows exactly where it will land. Ideas can shift, perspectives can evolve. 2 people can walk into a conversation with different viewpoints and still allow those viewpoints to interact with each other. The conversation itself is allowed to grow. Talking at someone is different. Talking at someone happens when one person already knows where the conversation must end. The conclusion exists before the conversation even begins. At that point, the conversation isn't really exploration anymore. It's delivery. The other person isn't there to participate in the idea. They're there to eventually agree with it or be corrected. And when that happens, the conversation starts to feel very different. You can still speak, you can still explain your perspective, but none of it actually matters because the conclusion was already protected before the conversation even started. And the interesting part about this is that most people doing this don't realize they're doing it. They genuinely believe they're having a conversation. They believe they're discussing an idea, but something invisible is happening underneath the surface. The ego has already attached itself to the conclusion. Once that happens, the goal of the conversation quietly changes. Instead of exploring the idea, the person begins defending it. They still listen, but they're not listening to understand. They're listening just enough to prepare their response. Just enough to find the point where they can explain why you're wrong. And once that pattern begins, the conversation stops evolving. Not because of disagreement, because disagreement can exist inside a real conversation. The problem is that the outcome of the conversation is no longer allowed to move. Some people enter conversations to explore ideas. Others enter conversations to defend them. And the difference between those 2 approaches determines whether a conversation can actually grow. When someone enters a conversation to explore an idea, they're open to seeing something they may not have noticed before. They might still hold their position, they might still disagree, but they allow another perspective to exist long enough to examine it. That willingness creates space. It allows the conversation to move. But when someone enters a conversation to defend an idea, the conversation is already constrained. The boundaries have already been built. And anything that challenges the conclusion becomes something that must be corrected. And once that happens, the conversation becomes a kind of performance. One person presenting their certainty, the other person slowly realizing they were never actually part of the conversation at all. When I find myself in a moment like that, I've made a very clear decision about how I respond. I'm not willing to sit quietly and be talked at. Not because I want to argue, and not because I need to win anything, but because I believe a conversation deserves the chance to be real. So instead of simply agreeing to end the tension, I hold my position. I restate my perspective. Sometimes I articulate it a different way, not to overpower the conversation, but to give the conversation another chance to become what it was supposed to be in the first place, an exchange. And when you do that, something interesting happens. The conversation almost always reaches a kind of crossroads. Sometimes the other person pauses. They slow down for a moment and actually consider another perspective. They might not agree. They might still hold their original position, but they allow another idea to exist without immediately trying to destroy it. And when someone can do that, it changes the way you see them. There's respect in that moment, because it shows a willingness to step outside of certainty long enough to examine something new. Two people can walk away from a conversation like that with completely different viewpoints and still carry on with mutual respect, because the conversation itself remained open. But the other outcome appears just as often. Instead of openness, the challenge threatens the certainty that was holding the conversation together. The ego reacts, the person becomes defensive, sometimes irritated or dismissive, and sometimes the conversation closes completely. Not because two people disagreed, but because the disagreement exposed something that wasn't allowed to be questioned in the first place. And when that happens, the conversation doesn't just stop evolving. Sometimes the connection itself disappears with it. The strange thing about all of this is that disagreement has never been the real problem. People can disagree about almost anything and still have meaningful conversations. The real dividing line is much smaller than that. A real conversation doesn't require agreement. It only requires one simple willingness: the willingness to consider another perspective. Not adopt it, not surrender your position, just allow it to exist long enough to be examined. Because the moment that willingness disappears, the conversation has already changed into something else. And once the outcome is already decided, the conversation is already over, even if the talking continues.